Hey, so this is a segment from a longer video. If you'd like to check out that video, you can click the link in the description, or we got the card up here. You can click that button. It'll drop down and I'll have the video right in there. So, enjoy. This is There's a Wocket in My Pocket by Dr. Seuss. Now in this book, I can read about a Findo in my window and a Nookcase in my bookcase, waskets and baskets and Zelfs on shelves, Vugs under the rug, Yeps on steps, and even Zowers in the shower. Now for me personally, since I have this special edition book, I can read on the last page here that it says, what you've read up till now was fictitious and odd. But here's the truth, all scripture is breathed out by God. For teaching, for reproof, for correction, and more, scriptures, I say, will be profitable for, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every last wondrous feat. Is that all true? Was the entire book here full of fictitious information up until we got to that last page? Yeah. And the part that the book said was true. Do Christians all believe that's true? That all scriptures are breathed out by God and profitable for these things, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every last wondrous feat? In other words, every good work? Yeah, Christians would say that's all true. For instance, Jordan here just read that same information in Paul's letter to Timothy, and Jordan seemed to believe that was all true. So whether we're reading this teaching in Paul's letter or in a Dr. Seuss book, if the teaching's true in one place, then it's true in the other. Now, fun fact, the scriptures were not written as a single book. Instead, the writings that make up the scriptures were written over several years, and eventually they were compiled together into one book that Christians refer to as scriptures. So if you've been watching the channel before, you've seen this. The video where we got this is linked in the description. It is also in the card. You don't have to watch that to understand this video. But this represented the Old Testament. There were a bunch of writings, all written at different times, some by different people, and somehow those books all got bound together and recognized as scriptures. Then Jesus showed up. And Jesus was respecting the scriptures, but he was also teaching things that were not in these scriptures. And eventually people started writing those things down in separate writings. This also took place over the course of several years, and the authors of some of these writings were different. So someone wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul wrote a bunch of stuff, and in addition to those, there were also writings that were written at that time that we do not consider scripture today. But at some point in time, someone or something, we'll call it Source X. Source X! Source X already referred to certain books as scriptures, but Source X then claimed that other books should also be included under that label of scripture. One of those writings that they included happened to be Paul's letter to Timothy, which is represented here by There's a Wocket in My Pocket. Other writings that were recognized as scripture were written before this letter that Paul wrote to Timothy, and still other writings that were included were written after that letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. Anyway, Source X recognized that these books were scripture, and Source X compiled what we now know as scriptures. So Source X said this compilation of writings is scripture. Now, of course, they weren't referring to this compilation of these particular writings, they were referring to this one, but the idea of how it got put together is the same. Someone or something, Source X, told Christians to do this. And now we have this compilation of a bunch of different writings all in one place. So in order for Jordan B. Cooper to have his Bible today, this compilation process had to take place. But wait a second, what was that thing that Jordan said earlier about the scriptures?
Scripture places itself as this authority that is so connected to God himself that he breathed it out, that the burden is really on them to prove that anything else has those characteristics.
So according to Jordan, scriptures places itself as this authority that is so connected to God himself that he breathed it out. But when did scriptures ever do that?
Scripture is God-breathed. It is breathed out by God. That in and of itself is not said of anything else, so it inherently gives Scripture a uniqueness that nothing else has. We are never told that there is a tradition or a set of traditions or a magisterium that are God-breathed.
All right, so to clarify that, the most that Jordan B. Cooper can actually verify is that if we limit ourselves to the writings that Jordan B. Cooper has decided to consider scripture, then we are never told that there is a tradition or a set of traditions or a magisterium that are God-breathed. However, it's just as easy to say, and also factually accurate to say, that if we limit ourselves to those same books, we are never told that there is not a tradition or a set of traditions or a magisterium that are God-breathed. So those are both facts, but neither of them prove either side. They don't help us, they don't hurt us. And the question still remains, when did scriptures ever place itself as an authority that is so connected to God himself that he breathed it out? Jordan is pointing out this portion of a letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. And that letter talks about all scripture and how it's breathed out by God. But that letter never claims to be scripture. In fact, There's a Wocket in My Pocket, which I have right here in this compilation now. That also states the very same fact. that all scripture is breathed out by God. And just like that letter that Paul wrote to Timothy never claimed that it itself was scripture, or breathed out by God for that matter, my version of There's a Rocket in My Pocket never claims that it itself is scripture, and never claims to be breathed out by God. So that letter could be just like There's a Rocket in My Pocket. It could be sharing useful information, true information, but that doesn't make it scripture, and that doesn't make it breathed out by God. But these two verses in this letter that Paul wrote to Timothy seem to be all that Jordan is using to support his claim that scripture places itself as this authority that is so connected to God himself that he breathed it out. If that's all that Jordan is using to say that scripture places itself as this authority that is so connected to God himself that he breathed it out, then Jordan would have no way of saying that this is not scripture. Like literally this compilation of books, Dr. Seuss, Muppet Babies. If Jordan is going here to this letter from Paul to Timothy and saying that this bit of information here is scripture placing itself as this authority that is so connected to God himself that he breathed it out, then Jordan B. Cooper has no way of denying that this is scripture. Because this book teaches that same exact thing, and we put it together with all these other books that don't say that, but we put it next to this one, so I guess that means they're all scripture and they're all breathed out by God now. And that actually leads us to the next point. What if yeah, that worked. What if I take this book out of these? I guess I'll reassemble this. That was supposed to be much cleaner. Okay, so now we have all these books which Jordan approves of, pretending that this is the Bible. And then we have this letter which Paul wrote to Timothy. This was the only place where it was ever said that all scriptures are breathed out by God. None of these other writings say that. So that's awfully convenient for Mr. Cooper, isn't it? He's taking a bunch of books, the ones he thinks are scripture, and then he's taking this book as well. And he's just going right ahead and he's putting that in the mix. So let's see if I can make less of a mess this time and get you back in there. Oh yeah, that went a lot more smoothly. So there's a bunch of different writings that Jordan believes in. They were all written as separate writings over the course of several years. Now, one of the writings that Jordan likes is this letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. And it talks about how all scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for these things, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. The problem is that writing never claimed to be God-breathed, and it never claimed to be scripture. However, that fact does not stop Mr. Cooper from saying that this writing is both breathed out by God and scripture. And that's not all. Mr. Cooper has decided that all of these writings should be bound together with this writing here, because Jordan thinks that all of these are breathed out by God, even though most, if not all of these, never claim to be breathed out by God or scripture. Not that a writing claiming to be scripture would really matter anyway, because if we took this book out and we read it, and I read Black Fish, Blue Fish, Old Fish, New Fish, this one has a little star, this one has a little car. Life under the sea paints such a pretty picture. Hey, by the way, you should know this is scripture. Really? Okay, well, that's informative. I guess we should staple that to this bad boy because we just found another book from scripture. Does that make any sense? Should you just read a book and if it tells you it's scripture, then it's scripture? No, it could be scripture, but it could also be one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. The point is, so far, I'm doing exactly what Jordan does to compile his scriptures. I'm taking a book, my revised version of There's a Rocket in My Pocket, and while that book tells me that all scripture is breathed out by God, it never defines what scripture is, and it never claims to be scripture itself. And by define what scripture is, I mean it never tells us which books should be considered scripture, let alone what should be in those books. And I'm binding this together with a bunch of other writings, none of which claim to be scripture or even define what scripture is. And then after I've done all this, I'm just saying, this is scripture. And likewise, Jordan is taking his compilation of books and he's saying, this is scripture. So what's the difference between this compilation of writings and this compilation of writings? The difference is that source X said that this compilation of writings is scripture, whereas source X never said the same about this compilation of writings. So both Jordan and myself are relying on source X to tell us what the scriptures are. And my question for Mr. Cooper, if you're watching, is who or what is source X that told you what the scriptures were? Hey there, me again. You probably remember me from the beginning of this video. I was also in the middle of the video, but that was a me from another time. This is the me from like 20 seconds after the beginning of this video. We're all kind of the same me. Anyway, you can check out that full video by clicking the link in the description or find it in the card up there. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe to this channel, click the notification bell, then all, share it with friends, and catch you next time. This is How to Be Christian. You all have a great day.